Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thank you for joining us. We are on the verge of the second impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump. Senate majority and minority leaders Schumer and McConnell have agreed on a schedule, with the proceedings set to start Tuesday. While Democrats and Republicans don't agree on much, both sides are expressing an interest in expediting the process, with some party leaders aiming to wrap it up within a week's time. In a statement Monday, Mr. Trump's legal team said they were, quote, pleased that there was bipartisan support on how to structure the impeachment trial, and went on to call the proceedings unconstitutional. We'll have more on that soon. Meanwhile, 56% of Americans want former President Trump to be convicted and barred from running for office again. That's according to a new poll from ABC and Ipsos. It comes as new numbers from Monmouth University show 3 in 4 Americans feel the country is now divided when it comes to our most important values. President Biden is trying to stay out of the impeachment debate, instead focusing on his push to pass more pandemic aid for the country. He told reporters, quote, we'll let the Senate work that out as he returned to the White House after a weekend in Delaware. Mr. Biden sat down with CBS News for his first network news interview since his inauguration. He expressed concern about the state of the government's pandemic response when he took over and laid out how he wants to move ahead.
That's why one of the disappointments was when we came into office is the circumstance relating to how the administration was handling COVID was even more dire than we thought.
The Trump administration.
The Trump administration. We thought they indicated there was a lot more vaccine available, and it didn't turn out to be the case. So that's why we've ramped up every way we can. I got a call through Commissioner Goodell saying we could have all 32 NFL stadiums available for mass vaccinations. But the idea that this can be done and we can get to herd immunity much before the end of this summer is very difficult.
Ed O'Keefe, Nikole Killion, and Olivia Beavers join me now. Ed is a CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Nikole is a CBS News congressional correspondent, and Olivia is a congressional reporter for Politico. Welcome. It is good to see you all. Ed, let me start with you. The Biden administration seems determined to stay out of the impeachment process. Why?
They sure do. In part because I think they understand the most basic thing. He's not a senator anymore, despite the fact that he spent most of his political career there, loves the place, says he loves the place, thinks about it a lot. They don't want him engaged in this because they understand the politics of it are fraught enough as it is. They don't want to create an appearance as if Democrats and the new president are trying to punish the old president, even though there is a trial being held and Democrats are certainly seeking to punish or hold him accountable. They also, I think, are quite eager to demonstrate to the country this week in whatever way that while Congress and the former president are dealing with what they're dealing with, he remains focused on what they believe right now is issue number one, and that is controlling and ending the pandemic. And so that's why today, for example, you see him on this virtual tour of a vaccination site in Arizona, while you will see them continue to hold briefings on the subject later in the week, and why they will continue to put him at different places around town, because he doesn't really leave Washington, appearing and being presidential as much as possible and staying out of the fray. Look, the politics of this are a few things. A majority of the nation believes he should be held accountable, but Republicans in the Senate aren't likely to convict him. The ultimate political price to be paid for holding this trial is unclear, so in their view, better to keep him completely out of it.
Well, Nikole, you spoke with New York Congressman Hakeem Jeffries about the impeachment trial. He served as a House manager for the first Trump impeachment. Here's what he said about the task at hand.
Well, I think from my standpoint, making sure you strike that right balance between trying to convince the senators when you know you're playing in a away game with a potentially hostile crowd, at least on one side of the aisle, and never losing track of the fact that, yes, though it may seem like the odds are against you, you have to fight as hard as you can for every single person who is sitting in that court of impeachment.
So, Nikole, what can you tell us about how the managers want to present their case?
Well, look, as far as Congressman Jeffries is concerned, it is a bit of deja vu for him. It was actually about a year ago that we actually talked about the first impeachment trial. And, he made the point then that this was about doing their constitutional duty as the House. And so similarly, what you heard there from him was him talking about some of the lessons learned, because in essence, it is deja vu in the sense that the former president may once again get acquitted. But the way Congressman Jeffries put it to me is that this really comes down to a numbers game. And he does feel confident this time around that perhaps, there may be a shot at picking off more Republican senators. Now, we know that 5 Republicans did vote with Democrats to allow this trial to go forward. And so in his view, this is about just trying to pick off 12 more if you can. That is still an uphill climb, knowing that 45 Republican senators voted against this trial going forward. But in terms of the House impeachment manager strategy, we know that they will be heavily relying on video evidence. Much of us have already seen those images from January 6th. We know they have been culling video, putting that together, and that really is their strongest evidence that they plan to put forth, and really using the former president's words against him. On the flip side, I also talked with Jason Miller, who is still an advisor to the former president, and he contends that the president did not incite an insurrection, that in essence this was just political speech, and it's no different than what we have heard from other lawmakers on the other side of the aisle. And of course, in terms of some of the legal briefs that have been filed today, his team also argues that this trial is unconstitutional because the president is no longer in office, whereas you have the House impeachment managers who feel that this video evidence they plan to put forward really is just overwhelmingly makes a statement that the president is guilty. So those are the two arguments you will likely hear from both sides as this trial gets ready to get underway.
So, Olivia, let me turn to you. This is the second time that we've spoken since you were at the Capitol attack last month.
Yes.
This impeachment is something very personal to a number of senators who were there as well. I wonder, Nikole touched on it there, but how is the Trump team planning to defend the former president? And how much realistically do those arguments actually matter, given what we know about where Republicans stand already?
Right. Well, Elaine, like you touched on, this is a very personal impeachment where the impeachment managers are not just the witnesses, but so is the jury per se. And so a lot of these senators were rushed for their lives, and now they're going to be having this video in which Democrats are trying to spin this story about how rhetoric for months basically built up to a point where basically the balloon burst and we had this deadly attack. And so, some of the members of Congress that I've spoken to are basically worried about being triggered by watching some of the tape that is rolled. But, after the vote with Rand Paul, it seems like it's a little bit of a foregone conclusion, with most Republicans citing that this is an unconstitutional process. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some Republicans who can be swayed to come over to the other side. We're watching Ben Sasse and Pat Toomey and other potential Republicans who are looking to retire. But, one thing that is really interesting about this is when we look at the past impeachment, there was a split screen sort of between Republicans saying right off the bat that they were going to be an instant no. We've seen that a little bit, but right after the attack, when I talked to Republicans, they were horrified. They were horrified that the president did not immediately tell the rioters to stand down. And that is one of the points that actually Trump's defense team is going to argue, is that he didn't encourage the rioters to keep going. It wasn't his fault. He didn't allow them. He actually was horrified by that moment. But their approach is to deny and say Democrats have been coming at us since the start of the administration. So basically deny any of these allegations and say that they've been a target all along.
Olivia, I want to touch on something, and if it's too personal, I completely understand, but you said a moment ago that some of the senators you've spoken with are concerned about being, and you used the word triggered. When we talked to you last time, Olivia, I had just read your very personal, searing account of what it was like in the Capitol to bear witness and to be there as the attack was unfolding. I wonder if there's been discussion among the senators, among reporters who were there about that aspect of this event, because separate from the impeachment trial itself, we know, and I've interviewed victims of trauma who have been through situations where they were deeply traumatized. Recounting these kind of events can have a very triggering effect, as you said, and reliving that. Is there any discussion about that component of it?
Absolutely. So Congressman McGovern, who was one of the members of Congress presiding in the House on the day of the attack, and was there within sight when the rioter Ashley was shot, told my colleague that basically it's been very hard for him. He'll be watching closely, but he described how this is going to be a difficult process after already a difficult couple of weeks, and it's more so said privately than it is publicly. But I know that reporters, I know that staffers, and I know that members of Congress are all, kind of bracing for CCTV images or footage that they haven't seen before that shows just what they went through in a whole new traumatic light. And it's hard sometimes to tell what's going to set off this trauma, but I think that trauma is still very prevalent. There's still a lot of counseling. There's still PTSD, and on a personal level, I'm still grappling with it and trying to process it. And so it just makes, unlike the Ukraine phone call, it makes this one so much more personal for everyone sitting through and watching these videos. And so that's what's going to be kind of interesting to see is, does this trigger some sort of action or push again for the attack to have a full review, like the 9/11 Commission that we've heard kicked around, but never actually seen it come to fruition. So that's something that I'm watching for as more of a consequence for this trial coming up.
Well, I said
Thank
it
you for
before,
asking.
Olivia, when you were on earlier. I thank you and all the colleagues there on Capitol Hill who have continued to provide us coverage, because the story is very much ongoing. And I don't know that people at home recognize how difficult it is to continue to bring these events that are unfolding on Capitol Hill in the aftermath of what took place on January 6th. There's just a lot that's taking place that you're having to juggle. So I really appreciate all your
Elaine,
work. And Ed, go ahead, Olivia.
Oh, and I just want to say thanks for giving the platform to also talk about the after effects, because I sometimes find that trauma can be processed. You can go through something traumatic together, but it can be processed alone. And so I've been trying to use my platform and speak out on how it's personally affecting individuals, including staffers, since this should not be something that, goes unnoticed, is how people respond in the aftermath.
It's such an important point that it's not just the lawmakers that we see in front of these cameras speaking. There are a whole slew of other folks who are on Capitol Hill. I do want to ask Ed about this COVID relief bill, because this is something that I know Olivia has continued to cover as well, because there are still so many Americans, of course, who are anxiously looking to Washington. Yeah. This latest COVID relief bill is including a tax credit for $3,600 a year for each child under 6 and $3,000 for each child between the ages of 6 and 17. And as this bill continues to take shape, what are the White House's priorities and what are they willing to give up?
Well, to the very basic of those two questions, the president made clear last week, and they've reiterated in the days since, $1,400 checks have to go out, and that amount specifically to Americans to make good on a campaign promise that the president made, especially, frankly, to voters in Georgia, where they were having those two special runoff elections later last year into early this year. And what is up for negotiation, what I think we'll see, especially the House this week and eventually the Senate in the next 2 weeks, debate, is who exactly gets that money. What is the income threshold cutoff? What is, what are the other requirements or things that could be held against somebody for getting that money? But regardless, the president wants to see $1,400. The other notable concession he made to Norah O'Donnell in that interview that first aired on Friday is he conceded that the fight over the minimum wage will have to wait for another day. He noted that in the vote-a-rama, or that overnight vote that the Senate held on non-binding amendments, there was one sort of test vote regarding the fate of the minimum wage, and it lost, which was a signal to everybody that it, as written or as proposed, would not be implemented, at least at this time, given the pandemic. but he said he's willing to hold a debate and have a fight over implementing changes to the minimum wage where things would get scaled up over the course of a few years. That's how it was done in the past. He signaled he'd like to see that happen. That will put him at odds with members of his own party who want to see a $15 an hour minimum wage increase added to this bill, part of the legislation. They cite a Congressional Budget Office report that was put out just this morning, a study that found that it would add considerably to the deficit, might also cause some modest increases or decreases, I guess, in the unemployment rate, but ultimately actually lead to job losses because of the detrimental effect it would have on small businesses. Regardless, the fight will continue, but as the president signaled, it probably won't be part of this legislation. The other thing to watch over the course of this week as the House begins putting the bill together and then as it heads to the Senate is there something else that should be added or subtracted from this to make it easier for moderate Democrats and to possibly win over some Republican votes? We'll wait and see.
So, Nikole, how long could it be before this round of aid is passed?
Well, they really want to get this done as soon as possible, to Ed's point. And so we're hearing, at least on the House side, they could start putting forth this legislation in earnest towards the end of the month, around the week of February 22nd. And so they're kind of using these next couple of weeks to move things out of committee. And so that's kind of why you're seeing, various provisions being introduced and being added to this bill, obviously, subject to change in the Senate, but certainly we expect by the end of the month that perhaps some of these first votes will start to take place.
All right, Ed O'Keefe, Nikole Killion, and Olivia Beavers, thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.